Good morning, everyone. My name is Sophie Gallier, and I am the current editor-in-chief of the Colorado Law and Technology Journal, Colorado Technology Law Journal. Got to get the acronym right. It's changed a few times over the years. But I'm so excited to welcome everyone here. I think more than 17 years ago, a group of students and Phil started this conference, and we started putting it on as our flagship conference of CTLJ. And we are so excited to see what it has become. Over the past few years, I know many people in this room know that the term net neutrality was coined in our journal. Michael Powell's 4 Pillars of the Internet, that speech was coined in our journal. And looking through our our symposium edition from last year, we are so excited. We're in the final moments of finishing it up as we realized we had a italicization problem with the periods. So our editors are currently going through and making sure that everything's perfect. Well, close to, as perfect as you can be. But we're going to be publishing Vint Cerf's keynote speech from last year about internet security. Ann Washington gave a great speech about bias in algorithms. Adam Thier gave a great speech about soft law and how it's equipped to govern changing technologies. And Christopher Yu sort of took a historical look at how we can look at history to make our security more robust. So those are the forthcoming articles. And then moving ahead to this year, this panel's, I just wanted to give our journal a quick plug. But Blake, you can feel free to supplement anything that I miss on the introductions. But we're very excited to start this panel with Blake Reed, who is our clinical professor here. He's done a phenomenal job doing work at the law school. I think his sort of bio speaks for itself, but he will be moderating the panel. We have Casey Claffey, who is the founder and director of the Center for Applied Sciences, David Clark, who is the Senior Research Associate Professor at MIT, and Jack Waters, who's the CTO for Zayo, and they will be talking about the changing, the changing dynamics of platform dominance. So, are we set to go? Yeah, I don't need this. We're just going to jump in. I'm going to do one more quick. Sarah, who's been amazing, she's our CTLJ's incoming executive editor. She organized this entire conference and will be emceeing the conference from here on out. So I just want to give Sarah a quick round of applause as I pass over the mic to her for the future. And we're ready to go.
All right, we'll jump right in and get started. Wonderful to see everyone here today. This marks I think the 12th one of these that I've been to. I feel like I'm getting old here, but an occasion or thing about. Oops, is that good? Got it. No. Let's see. How's that? Okay. So on occasion of getting old, I had a chance to go back and look at some of the early volumes of the journal and some of our early conferences. And actually the very first article that we published in the journal back in 2003, it was an article by Phil Weiser called Information Platforms. And that was sort of a new idea back then, that term, information platforms. And so I thought this morning it might be profitable for us to discuss, since the theme for this conference is internet platforms, rising dominance and evolving governance, that maybe we should do some level setting on what internet platforms mean. The description of this conference sort of suggests that we might be talking about application platforms like Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, and the like. But the definition that Phil had in mind was perhaps a bit broader than that. And we've got folks who are involved in identifying some definitions in a technical sense that are a bit broader than that. So I wanted to open it up to David and Casey. Let's grapple with this idea of what is an information platform. Maybe I'll start with you, David.
It's interesting. I'm standing here because I'm waiting for this thing to either come alive or not. I wasn't going to show a video, but I would have put up one slide in answer to your question. But life is. Oh dear. Platform is clearly an overused word. I think it's been used in some contexts where it means so many things it doesn't mean anything. I think a lot of the conversations we've had about dominance or market power, if you just delete the word platform from the conversation, it looks just the same. But there are some interesting specific definitions of platform that we found, and in fact, in hunting around, we found a couple that I think are substantially different, and I found people talking past each other because they didn't understand what they meant by the word platform. I think to an engineer, the word platform is a technology on which you build other technologies. So the operating system, Windows or Android OS or whatever, is a platform because you build apps on top of it. And then those are used in something else. And I have a picture here, if I can ever find it, that talks about the layers of the internet. And you can view each of those layers as a platform because people are building on top of them. There's a draft document, it's not out yet, unfortunately, but there's a draft document coming out of the OECD, which talks about platforms, and they have a substantially different definition of platform in there. They have equated platform to an online two-sided market. And they wanted to emphasize the two-sidedness. They specifically said something like Amazon Web Services is not a platform because it's not a two-sided market. You just put stuff on it. Where to an engineer, you say, well, it's a platform because I put stuff on it. You build on it. The essence of a platform is something you can build on top of. There was an extreme definition of platform I found in one paper, which basically said if it's programmable, if it's a platform, otherwise it's not. Well, that's obviously an engineer answering here. So I don't think we need to agree. We just have to understand what we're saying before we say platform. But if we ever get a picture here, I'll put up a picture that Casey and I drew several years ago, which is a layered, it's a picture of the access network as a series of layered platforms. And so, but try some other definitions here and see what you get.
Yeah, so let me open it up to Casey and Jack. What do you think about these competing definitions? And do we need to settle on one, or what are your thoughts?
Dave passed me a draft OECD paper that's going to come out in a couple weeks, I guess, where they have put in an appendix a typology of platforms. So, I mean, I think you can decide what you want it to mean in Alice in Wonderland space as long as you're consistent about what you want it to mean and that it's informing the conversation that you want to have. And I don't think from what I'm getting from the intro and the framing of this workshop, that the emphasis is on the platform. It seems to me the emphasis is on the dominance part. And so, but what's interesting to us and what we put in the platform paper that we wrote a few years ago was what makes the internet ecosystem arguably different, but I don't know enough about other ecosystems, is that the layeredness of the platforms, all the way from the physical layer up to IP, I mean internet, the IP architecture itself or the implementation of it is a platform on which other things are built, applications are built. AWS is a platform, Facebook is a platform on which other things are built. But the ability to cross platform layers, which you see happen in the internet ecosystem, and in the or the way economics thinks about that is you use maybe dominance in one area of an ecosystem to establish dominance or leverage dominance in another area. I think the platform aspect, and I mean the layered, integrated with interfaces between platforms, the sort of technological platform aspect of the internet, both facilitates this crossing of platform layers, which can promote dominance quickly and stickily, because platforms are sticky, and also makes it harder in the internet ecosystem to assess it, to measure it. Now, dominance it by itself isn't a harm, and so I keep coming back to the question of what is the harm that we're trying to address here? And the intro paragraphs on the page of this workshop talk about different regulatory or policy levers, tools to deal with the platform dominance, but I have a hard time, because I'm not a lawyer, mapping. Maybe lawyers have a hard time too, or it would be on that page, mapping the tool to the harm that we're trying to address. And so I think it's really critical, and I mean, I can list 10 harms that I come up with here that I see potentially happening in the ecosystem. All of them, I think a problem is measurement of the harm. I mean, you have identification of the harm and precise identification of the harm, measurement of the harm, and then mapping that to a tool that might address the harm, and then having some way to assess whether whatever tool you use actually made a difference in the harm. So it's sort of measurement of impact and correlation or causation, establishing causation between the policy tool or whatever tool you use and reduction of the harm or increase of the good thing that you want to aspire to. So I know this panel was supposed to be sort of level setting of the technology, but I'm hoping that as we come back to these issues during the day that, and I might raise my hand and ask questions, we try to be as precise as we can about what is the harm that we're trying to address with this thing that we're talking about right now. So, talk about harms, and my background is internet measurement, computer science with some interdisciplinary aspects folded in, but really trying to measure the evolution of the ecosystem, the structure, the dynamics, the workload, the traffic, the topology, of which there's been dramatic changes over the last 10, 20 years. Most of them, I would argue, driven by forces of political economy, maybe policy forces too, decisions that are made on in a regulatory context that drive behavior in the commercial context that then maybe establish new forms of dominance or reduce other forms of dominance. And so the question is, again, how does the technology inform, or how can the technology inform how you think about platform dominance, not just at this, as you say, application layer? I would argue Google's way more than an application platform. And when you talk about dominance, you don't necessarily mean at the application platform. In fact, I would argue that to some extent, any platform that I've heard people worry about the dominance of, it's not because it's a platform at one layer. It's because it's a platform that has crossed layers in some sense, or as the economics might say, moved into other businesses and leveraged dominance in one area to establish dominance, or at least threatened the stability or whatever. And maybe all that's a good thing. Maybe it's disruptive innovation. And that's why my home is measurement, so I keep wanting to say, okay, how would you measure that? And what is the tool by which you would try to manipulate that if you're trying to manipulate that? So I'll rattle off my harms. Discrimination. That's a classic harm, and that's where we get, when you cross a platform, then you have, when you own a certain platform and you establish a market at a platform above that, a layer above that, now you have the opportunity to perhaps discriminate, whether it's traffic or application discrimination. The App Store, there's been cases of, well, an app can't get in the App Store. Is there discrimination happening at the App Store layer? Or indeed economic discrimination, which is like the best way to discriminate, most effective way to discriminate. The big one we hear talked about is privacy. Privacy is, again, often when I drill down into a harm that is privacy, I find a platform layer crossing happening. So I think that's important to be thinking about. Is the platform layer crossing the thing that needs attention, or at least a way to have discourse about, which I think we have lacked thus far. And it's not just privacy, right? It's misuse of data, maybe, or potential misuse of data. In which case, again, how do we measure it? The transactions are pretty opaque right now. So maybe what we need first is to have some transparency to the transactions. How do you get there? And what harm might be imposed by even trying to achieve such transparency? Security, trustworthiness, trustworthiness not just of the user, but even of the advertising side. How does the advertiser know that their advertising is being effective? There's a lot of opacity there. Price discrimination is another example of discrimination. Is perfect price discrimination a threat to open markets? That's getting talked about in economic circles lately. Monopoly pricing, obviously, we have some traditional old school harms. And then we have big, more abstract harms like freedom, autonomy, justice. I'm not saying they're too abstract. Indeed, those are the harms that we find wars getting fought over and revolutions getting launched, people dying over. But I still want to find a way to measure, to turn this into something that we could measure and then tie a tool to it. How would we know that tool is actually working? Okay, I'll try that.
So I want to pick up these questions of dominance and harm in some more detail, but I want to invite Jack into the conversation. So we've been over already defining platforms, and now we're starting to talk about problems. But anything to add to the platform definition piece?
I think the first question you asked was, do you have to agree on what the definition of platform? I don't know if it matters. I don't know if you have to agree. It's very perspective driven. We've always thought of platform as network, kind of originally, I think is a reasonable place that we started. Probably Phil's paper, I haven't read it, but I assume way back into the dark ages when he wrote it, it had something to do with networks and ISPs and those sorts of things. The important thing, though, that I think that has happened is that platforms, whatever your definition is, they've developed and changed. There have been ones added over time. it's not to mean that any of the dominance issues have gone away for the ones that existed prior. And I think that many times people want to jump to, oh my gosh, are the social platforms suddenly a platform in which dominance, we need to worry about dominance now about those platforms and forget about all the other ones, because I don't think that's the case at all. That would argue that we somehow fix something along the way. I'm not quite, not that I believe everything's broken either, but I certainly believe that we haven't fixed all of the original platform issues as well. And part of, as I read the original premise of this discussion, you sort of jump to the, well, now we're just going to worry about the social platforms or the search platforms or whatever. The one thing I do believe, and very much my own personal opinion, is that the market has helped to decide. And probably as the resident capitalist on this panel every year, I do believe that. I do think that the market helps drive decision more than we would like it, or maybe this conference thinks at times. But I do think if you go back and look at companies and that we worried about probably 50 years ago, what was the company we worried about the most 50 years ago having dominance?
Yeah.
AT&T.
IBM?
IBM.
AT&T? Do we still worry about those two companies as having? And I would actually argue more about IBM than AT&T, because you could argue that MFJ made that go away. But put AT&T to the side for a second and look at the companies that had dominance like IBM.
So, Jack, let me take your invitation here to go back to some of these original problems. And Dave, in your 1984 paper where you articulated some of the layer stack that you alluded to, one of the concerns that was obviously motivating that paper was the dominance issues in the telecommunications industry and the computer industry, and thinking about how do we design a network that doesn't put control entirely in the hands of a dominant provider. Do you see those issues as still being salient today? And maybe that's an obvious question, as we just had an oral argument about net neutrality. But how do you see those issues materializing today, and if they're different in any way than they were back when you started this enterprise?
1984 was a long time ago. And I don't know that we need to go all the way back there to figure out what's going on here. Let's just say, let me try a few thoughts and see how this works. And I'm sorry, I got to talk for a while. This nice person's trying to get my talk, and I sent her the wrong talk, and this is just sort of like, oh,
We'll get there, we'll get there.
don't worry about it. But the fact that the internet was going to be built out of networks, that it's a net of nets, which, as you begin to think about how the network's actually constructed by organizations as opposed to engineers, means it's an internet built out of organizations. How many autonomous systems are there these days?
70,000.
70,000. In that context, you get a particular perspective on dominance, I think. But it's not like there's one company that sort of controls the internet as a platform. And we tried very hard, although I don't think we understood it thoroughly in the very beginning, to try to define the interfaces between ISPs so that you could effectively get this co-opetition. And again, in the beginning, we weren't thinking about the commercial issues as much, so we weren't thinking about the competitive aspect. We were thinking about it more as a cooperative aspect, but we understood the pieces had to fit together. And that's both a power and a constraint, because it's those interfaces that define how the ISPs interconnect that, in some sense, constrain what the service is. The power of centralization here is something that really needs to be understood. I think if you talk to most computer scientists, they will say, if you could build a centralized solution to this problem, it's always easier. If you look at the email system and you say, well, all these distributed modes around, and all these email servers, and then they all have to talk to each other, and they talk to each other using a well-defined protocol, and that's wonderful. Except, of course, to evolve the email system, you may have to evolve that protocol. It's a very slow process. If email was just run by one company, then if they want to change it, they could just change it, for better or worse. So the trend of centralization, which in some sense can't happen at the internet layer because ISPs actually exist as entities on the face of the earth. I mean, you can't have one company like AT&T or Google or Comcast suddenly take over China. I mean, that doesn't happen. So the question in that context, what does dominance mean? I would say that we've had a lot of concerns about the access ISPs and whether they have market power and whether there's enough competition there. But I don't think that's a consequence of architecture. That's a consequence of the reality of the cost of building facilities. And Casey and I often argue about whether a different architecture for the internet could have produced an outcome, but I don't see how to change the economics of facilities. Unless the only way you're going to get competition there is among people who either have their own facilities or have been given access to somebody's facilities, usually through a regulatory intervention. But at a higher layer, where you look at something like Facebook, well, it's just much easier to build a centralized Facebook than to define all the protocols so that you can break it up into parts and all the things still works. And by the way, of course, it becomes easier to monetize and it becomes easier to control and exploit, whatever word you want to use. And obviously in the context of something like a Facebook, which is we built a network, so it shouldn't be surprising that on top of the network you get network effects. You sometimes get strong market tipping. And, I don't want to be the only person owning a fax machine, and I don't want to be the only person on Facebook, So it tips. And in some sense, none of this should surprise anybody. The question is, what do you do about it? But there's nothing unnatural about the push toward a centralized solution to a problem when it works, and a push toward a realization that you may get this convergence toward a winner-take-most outcome. Were we thinking about this in 1984? I don't even think that's a relevant question, if you see what I mean. I think some of this snapped into focus pretty quickly I'd say in the 90s when we started to see commercialization. But, there was sort of a hint in one of the documents here that, well, we should now start worrying about dominance at higher layers. And if you brought Tim Berners-Lee in here, who invented the web, he would have started screaming at you. And he would have said, for 10 years, I've been railing about the fact that there are really adverse consequences from these very centralized implementations of some of our critical applications. And he's been pushing really hard to try to understand how he could make something like a distributed social network system.
Sure.
Along the same sort of, you think about the distributed email system. There's lots and lots of little servers, and my social net's here, and social net's there, and then somehow they all talk to each other, and we can build all the protocols such that all these pieces fit together. And there have been lots of efforts to try to do that. There's the thing that Tim did, which is called Solid, and there's Diaspora and so forth. And guess what? They haven't gotten traction. And the reason they haven't gotten traction is that's really a much harder way to do it. And the centralized solution is much easier because you don't have to define those protocols. The protocols don't constrain the evolution of the product. But all of a sudden, now you have a global player. When did we sort of understand this? Well, certainly, if Tim would have said, we fully understood it 10 years ago, and we should have been dealing with it back then.
So
But I think one of the differences is I think about, if you think about it from the end user's perspective, the network effect of dominance or whatever on a social platform is because one person chose it, then two people chose it, then a third, then a fourth, and it built somewhat by its own popularity, if you will. I don't know a better word to think of it. Whereas the original concerns around network dominance weren't because the end user chose. And in many ways, the end user was chosen for themselves. And until the advent of this, did you end up with some modicum of choice. But prior to that, when you think about the concerns around dominance around networks, it wasn't, much of it came because of the fact that you did not get to decide as the end user who your platform was, which I think is a huge difference between today's concern around platform dominance and the dominance that happened whenever ago.
So Jack, I want to pick on that question a little bit. So we have, with the internet, some level of decentralization, but users funneled into particular modes, whether it's DSL in the early days or cable modems, or whatever the technology may be, they were sort of forced into it. On social networks, maybe users have choice at the outset, but then get funneled in with network effects. When we've got the level of dominance that builds up, what do you see as the difference for how it forms? Should that inform our policy thinking in any way, or does that inform the diagnosis of the harms that Casey talked about, or are we dealing with the same problem?
I think the end result kind of ends up being the same. Your harms were a good list of harms. But I mean, from an operator perspective, I look at the way you got there and say, one was, you could argue the nice way of just competition, a great idea, and look what happened. You kind of ended up with something that you still have this concern about. The other way is you got 100 years head start from a commitment that came in the early 1900s, or you were lucky enough to win a cable franchise in the early days of cable, and you got a lot of wind in your sail on the way. And I think maybe the way you got there, where you got to, may be the same thing. You're still worried about pricing. You're still, something that no one ever talks about, and I didn't really understand it until I read about it, was monopsony power. Which is all you lawyers are laughing at me. I'm a simple engineer from West Virginia, so I don't know about all this complicated law stuff. But that's an interesting one that doesn't come up much. But the notion that somebody who has incredible selling power also has incredible buying power, that one jumps out as a newer concern in this platform discussion of dominance that I hadn't really thought about. And I sell a lot of stuff, so maybe I should have thought about it. But boy, how would you like to be a seller of compute or storage to one of the four nexuses, purchasers of compute and storage in the world right now that buy 90+% of all compute and storage? Would you feel like monopsony power might be something that you'd be a little concerned with?
Yeah.
So let's pick up on this issue of harms, and I know, Casey, you alluded, we'll be talking about this all day, and you laid out a taxonomy of discrimination, privacy, security, monopoly, pricing. Let's see, freedom and justice. We can't
I just
forget,
wrote that up there, so that might not be complete.
can't forget about freedom and justice, very important. Responsibility is going to come up later. Let's dig into these harms, and from your perspectives as technologists, and Casey, maybe start with you. What do you see at any of the platforms, and I leave it to you to identify them, what do you see as the most salient concerns, and how do you know, to your question about how do we measure these things, what are you worried about?
This panel, no. So I'm an academic scientist, so I'm really trying to study the field. So if you ask me what I worry about, I try to catalog what do I see people worried about, and how are they measuring it, which is usually not that well. So I'll just, rather than have a personal position here, I'll just try to pick the one at the top, pick the one that everybody talks about, privacy right now. This is the big thing with the data mining and advertising, and how do we approach it? I mean, I think that the reason that one is getting a lot of airtime now is it's huge, it's pervasive, it sort of permeates everything, but it's also pretty abstract. And it's very difficult at this point, and as Dave observed with Tim Berners-Lee, like he might have predicted 10 years ago this was going to be a problem, sort of dominance over information flows, maybe you could think about it. And that it is not obvious at this point, since, how does he say, people have been asleep for 10 years, 20 years, how to think about even beginning to addressing the harm, or even measuring, or even describing it. And, you know, what are you going to do? The people are talking now about privacy regulation. GDPR taking a swing at this. I guess academics will wait a year and find out what the impact was. How do you measure the impact of GDPR on whatever the harms were it was trying to address? And if some other country tries to do something else, how can it learn from that to try to do better the next time? But I think we underestimate, especially Jack, who said markets have spoken. Markets have definitely spoken, and I don't think Dave and I are so anti-capitalist. I mean, we like cheap stuff too. So, but I think the underappreciated part of history is how much of the industry structure was designed before the markets got in. I mean, the NSF and DARPA before that, the US government was basically managing, funding, administering, operating the internet for 30 years before the markets have spoken. And indeed, they more or less designed the markets to speak that way. I mean, we did see evidence that there was commercial interest, and of course, the reason DARPA got out of the business in the 80s, and NSF, National Science Foundation, came in, was DARPA realized, well, there's non-defense people using the network. That's not really what DARPA money's for. And including a lot of like our universities using the network, maybe even a little bit of commercial stuff. But the real uptake at that point was universities were getting huge value out of the network. So the National Science Foundation said, hey, that's us. Maybe we can do it. And the National Science Foundation took over the backbone, at least, you know, the core part of the infrastructure, for at least 10 years, upgraded it a few times before it was clear that no, now there's some substantial commercial use of the network to talk to people at universities like Apple, you know, doing research with Stanford or UCLA or something. At which point the NSF realized, and others, made the clear point, well, we shouldn't be competing with, we shouldn't be perpetually operating in the telecommunications sector. There's enough commercial interest bubbling up now that we should get out of the business. But they did it quite carefully. In fact, I was part of the R&E network community at that time. I was at UCSD doing my thesis, my PhD thesis on internet traffic characterization. Thank God there was actually some data. You can't do that thesis now. There was some data because the National Science Foundation mandated there be data about the NSF net backbone provided so that NSF would have some idea about the growth of the network and how it was being used. And so the NSF orchestrated a transition to take the backbone away, but it didn't want to partition the network because the backbone was the thing that enabled the commercial sector to come forward, because you would connect to the backbone and you'd have a way to get to the other networks that the protocol was allowing you to get to. And in doing so, it made sure the regional network, the academic regional networks that it was still funding at that time, it would ramp down their funding over the years, basically saying you have to go make your own money. You have to go get revenue from the commercial sector. But it would only give it would ramp down its allowance from the government for a few years until it was gone. But it would only even give it that allowance if those networks promised and committed to stay connected to some exchange points that would enable this or prevent this partitioning from happening, the harm being partition. So there was total industrial policy in the 80s and 90s to make the internet, the ISP layer, be as competitive as well. We can see how well that worked out in the end, but it was the objective. I think they achieved the objective. It was a fantastic example of industrial policy. They did the same thing a couple of years later with ICANN.
Hold up,
That's another conference. We can talk about metrics of success for ICANN, but they exactly wanted to create a competitive industry in domain name provisioning, and they did. And they had metrics of success, and they tried to enforce transparency and accountability, and has multi-stakeholder and blah, blah, all these things we now know, and there's whole conferences dedicated to that, I guess. But I think what's interestingly different about today's concerns about the platform dominance, the platform ecosystem, the application layer and above, and the advertising ecosystem, none of that happened. There was no industrial policy. The government was back in the road of, okay, we've let the internet go off, and now we're going to just let it grow organically, let the free markets take care of it, as they have done very well. But now we're wondering, oh, maybe we need a little bit of oversight. Maybe we need a little bit of thinking about what are the potential harms. And I think the challenge is going to be, how do you do it now? Because what are you going to do? Okay, step one, figure out what the harm is. Like, okay, we need more transparency into the transactions that are happening in the ecosystem that fund the advertising, which is funding a huge amount of services. That we love these free services. But we don't understand, or some argue, we don't understand the nature of the transaction with the data that we're giving up to enable these services. How do we get more transparency into that transaction? Would it really work to have a GDPR-like thing that makes sure that every time I turn data over to one of the companies that's using the data, and it's not just these big platform companies. Sure. Almost every app is doing this, right? This is the major business model for providing us services on the internet. If we want more insight into the nature of that business model in order to analyze the harms of that business model, how do we get it? Because, as Dave would argue, giving each individual user some insight into where that data goes and how it's being used, not clear that that's going to scale or how it would work. Maybe what you would need, like the kind of thing that the government designed in the 90s for the DNS, is some industry players that do that sort of thing for you, that do that sort of analysis and become your proxy for, these are what my constraints are with respect to privacy, this is what I care about, this is what I don't care about, this is what I'm willing to have monetized as much as they want, and then have those players do that for me. Unclear how you would get there now.
So let's pick up this question of industrial policy shaping outcomes. We could even look at privacy in networks and look at the FCC's protections with its CP&I rules and all of that sort of thing as providing some protection, although that's been eroded pretty significantly in the last couple of years. If we go further up the stack where we basically have got very little foundation, or to the extent we have any foundation, we have things like Section 230, things like Section 512 of the DMCA that are pretty enabling for platforms to go out and do exactly the kind of things that you're talking about. How do we go put the genie back in the bottle if we see that there are significant harms? Is that something we can do? Is that something we should do? David, what do you think?
Don't think the genie goes back in the bottle.
What did you say?
Don't think the genie goes back in the bottle.
I don't think the genie
But step one, identify harms. Step two, think about how you would measure them. Right? And that's where these conferences are important, because these particular harms are very much having technology and policy embedded together, and we don't speak the same language.
I think there was an article distributed. I don't know whether you did or you did, but a economist article about the fact that today, everybody thinks there's stuff is free, right? As a consumer, you think, I use Google or I use Facebook or whatever, right? Don't mean to pick on them, great customers. But to the consumer, it's free. But what the article argued was to the consumer, they don't understand that their data is in fact the currency. And that is something that I think is missed on, maybe not to this room, but certainly to the average consumer. How much does your data play in as currency for these platforms? And that's something that I think is misunderstood, if not if understood at all, to the average consumer. To your point, or to the point that she said you would say, maybe if you provided enough data, consumers would care. It'd be so much you wouldn't know what to do anyway. But I do think that that's a pretty fundamental thing that I believe today consumers don't understand how much their data is in fact the currency for these platforms.
Well, and we explored this topic at our advertising and privacy conference a couple of years back. It's not entirely clear that advertisers fully appreciate that either. And
they just think they're smart and deserve all those incredible profits?
Yeah, and that sort of the currency is being created by the Googles and the Facebooks of the world telling advertisers that this is worthwhile. And that in fact, when we start to unpack that, maybe that isn't true. So maybe one last question to leave us with here, and then I'll turn to a student for the first question. Let's say that goes away, either through privacy regulation or transparency regulation of some sort.
That what goes away?
That the ability to monetize all of these services with data. Let's say that gets undermined. What's next? What results can we?
So I was going to make a prediction, and it's only in part driven by concerns like the erosion of ad profitability due to GDPR. But the people who are going to be the most efficient at capturing ad revenues are going to capture them. And you look at somebody like Facebook, who's managed with all these little like buttons and so forth, basically keep track of everything. They don't have to be part of some large advertising ecosystem. They know everything. And I think that we may discover that large parts of this free environment simply no longer survive on the ad revenues. And it was in the 1990s, Hal Varian said to me, the internet is about routing money, and routing packets is a side effect. And so here's the question. Who designs the money routing protocols? Because that's industrial structure. And I will tell you, the IETF will not design money routing protocols. They just scream and run away in panic because that's engineering industry structure and they think that's outside their scope. So who's going to design the money routing protocols? Is it going to be a dominant player? Or is it possible that a more distributed architecture for routing money could actually trigger a significant shift in what the economic ecosystem of the internet looks like over the next 10 years? There's a little tiny example I like to offer people, which is actually a for-profit firm called Patreon, where people who are doing things that are definitively non-commercial, artists, creative people, can basically put Patreon on their website, and it's a way for people to say, I like what you're doing, I'll give you a little money. And it makes it really easy. There's just a give money button, and Patreon, of course, is taking their fraction of this whole thing. But there are non-commercial creative people who say, I can now make a living. And they just stepped away from advertising. Advertising has nothing to do with this. The consumer of their product is willing to pay for it. So Patreon created a money routing protocol, okay? But I think you should ask that in a very abstract way. And is there going to be dominance in how new money routing protocols come into focus as we see what may be the erosion of this? By the way, if you take the total online advertising spend in the United States and you divide by the number of online people, it works out to about $25 a month. Now, we're worth a lot more because this is a room full of wealthy people. I got lawyers here, right? Or maybe the students, you just hope you'll be wealthy. So we're probably worth a lot more than $25 a month. And so there's a fairness issue here. Should the wealthy be paying for the less, oh my God, that sounds like taxation. But this is all about money routing. But it's important to have an order of magnitude. What are we talking about here, right? The total ad spend in the United States these days, online ad spend in the United States these days, is about $80 billion. That's the same as Comcast top line. We're not fighting over a lot of money here, guys. You know?
It's running out. There's only so much of that. But I want to push back on, let's assume we do something about the advertising. Advertising has been supporting services for way longer than the internet, right? Newspapers, radio, media, like forever. We like that unless we want to pay for bad TV. So it's not about the advertising, and that's why I want to keep coming. Advertising is not on my list. It's privacy, and even that is abstract. Privacy is kind of like freedom and justice. It's misuse of data, and until we can even determine there's misuse of data. I mean, we all have some idea that there's data being used in ways that we're not comfortable with, but we can't quantify that. I think what we need first is transparency into what the transactions are like, to Jack's point. Yeah. And my argument is the academics are not going to save you on that. The academics cannot give you those research papers because there's data missing. That's true of almost all things about the internet. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but in particular for this privacy issue, we need to decide what sort of data do we need and how do we get it to inform the analysis before we even talk about remedy.
I think if you, your question, even if that were all to go away, I love the example of I think that there's always going to be a dominant player in a market.
In any market?
In most. I'm sure you could come up with examples.
Automobiles.
And it goes up and it will ebb and flow. I mean, Sears, the greatest example ever. Sears had market dominance in retail. And not just retail walking into shops, but the internet of its day, mail order. Sears, who's now flirting with its third time through bankruptcy. Well, I believe that markets, are always subject to dominance, and hopefully in our free market, you get a new idea. That new idea is better than the last one. It has, its certain attributes, and it pushes forward. And I think that's what I think. If it were to go away, it'd be something else.
closing on that Schumpeterian note, I'll open it up to audience Q&A. And as always, the first question goes to students. And I'm looking over here because I see some folks in the front row that I'm not afraid to cold call, but I'll take a volunteer for about 10 seconds before I invoke that.
I'm going to call on you, for God's sake.
Quieted everyone down.
Sarah.
Hi, so Sarah Rippey, I'm a 2L here. So my question is with regard to transparency, and does it presuppose that people care about how their data is being used to the extent that they know that it's their currency? And how do you structure it so people, like for the GDPR, for example, going in and clicking, yes, I consent to this, people would rather use the website than just click then.
But that's the issue. That is in fact the issue. People, I believe that in many cases people don't know enough to care.
I believe that in all cases, people are not actually reading what they click through.
Oh yeah.
So how do you
You guys
solve
are
that,
writing
though?
them much too complicatedly.
How do
They
you
need to be
solve that?
cartoons.
It's one thing to require that they're given the opportunity to, but how do you turn around and make people actually read what they say they're reading?
Okay, so that goes to the point I was making earlier that I don't think the end users solve this problem. I think that you could argue the next killer app is privacy if people care about that, and there will be companies that emerge to offer to do this service for you if you care. And it will start out with organizations, companies, I don't know who analyze the problem first. But how do you analyze the problem today?
Well, and just to foreshadow for later in the day, we'll debate about whether we ought to consider that through an economic lens, or the correct view, which is maybe we should look at it through something else. Sorry, I'm moderating that debate, I hope. Other questions from the audience? Paul.
Paul Ohm, I'm part of that debate, so this is impolite for me to take more time. But so, Casey, I've never heard this like measurement fetishism that you were just displaying here, and I just want to understand where this is coming from. So the law
Somebody tweet that.
always deals with harms that are difficult to measure. I've been scribbling a bunch down: emotional distress, harms to the environment, harms to democracy. We come up with statutory damages for things that are difficult to measure.
Yeah.
Even if you restrict yourself to privacy,
Yeah.
we have laws that worry about anxiety, embarrassment, fear, regret, loss of control. We have the Wiretap Act, which doesn't require a measurable harm. We have the Privacy Act, which we could debate it. We have Do Not Call, which is about the annoyance when the phone rings during dinner. Why do we have to have a measurable thing be such an important part of what we decide we can solve or not solve on these platform problems? Why can't it be a problem that we all agree is a significant problem and maybe here's some tools to correct it? Why does the loss of a measurable quantity have anything to do with our analysis?
How are you guys doing with antitrust?
Sure, I mean, antitrust, right, would be wonderful if we could extend it to things that are hard to measure. Absolutely.
I would argue measurement is a huge problem there. If you're trying to use the consumer welfare standard,
Right.
and one of your prongs is the price to consumers going up,
Right.
and you're analyzing companies that largely give you services for which the price is completely opaque, but
Or
it's
zero.
zero if you
Zero.
have to put a unit on it today, your doctrine is failing you.
So you're preaching to the choir. So antitrust should
Well,
be
then why are
premised
you
on
yelling
things
at
that are
me?
not measurable. I'm with you. So we
Okay.
should break up companies that violate privacy. I agree. I think that's
I
what you
did
just
not say
said.
that.
I think that's what you just said. No. All right, I'm going to give up the mic 'cause I'm speaking.
I'll see you later in an alley, Paul.
So I mean, let's keep this question going for one more second. It's the closest person maybe to a hipster on the panel. We've taken this up in antitrust, right? And we've got a new school, or maybe it's an old school of antitrust that says we really shouldn't obsess about measurement in the way that we have, and we need to start thinking about dominance in terms of size as a problem, or dominance in terms
It's
of
not on my
dignitary
list.
harms.
It's not on my list. Dominance is not on my list. That's the problem.
Let me try. Since you said hipster, I don't know whether we really want to go there. Lightning may come out of the sky, but it's not size in that context. It is arguable harms that are being exacerbated by size, right? If you, so let's just say, okay, you said hipster, I'll say Lisa Kahn, and She talks, what?
Lena Khan.
Lena Khan,
No,
excuse
I
me,
get
Lena
it.
Khan. Not here by any chance, is it?
Is she? She wouldn't dare.
Who talks a lot about Amazon, and a lot of what she talks about is not dominance of a platform, but the fact that Amazon has inside it lots and lots of lines of business which can be cross-connected and correlated. And so they could, for example, use data about what you're buying, not just to do first-degree price discrimination against you, but also to figure out how to harm some of their competitors. Okay? And so do you go after that through antitrust? I mean, somebody here said CPNI, and there was an interesting blog by Harold Feld, who said the idea behind one of the very specific ideas about the privacy embedded in Title II with the CPNI was that telephone companies could not use the data they got from you to harm their competitors. So why doesn't that apply to any platform? Okay? That's not an antitrust remedy. That's not a break it up into little pieces remedy. That's an identified harm. Here's a kind of a rule you could apply. And, you know, so I think I think if you think about hipster, you shouldn't think about narrowly as should we try to reinvigorate the specific, perhaps old interpretation of antitrust. And I'm not a lawyer, so I think she was asking a deeper question than she was asking, which is there's some real harms here, and should we acknowledge that maybe they're hard to figure out how to address, but is the difficulty of addressing them through antitrust the fact that antitrust just doesn't happen to have the right tools, or are the difficulties more intrinsic, and are we actually just going to go face a hard problem? And maybe even if you wrote a new law, it would still be complicated, but that doesn't mean we can ignore the harms. So
We have to identify them.
But you have to
and so,
identify.
Paul, maybe measurement doesn't have to be very quantitative and unit-driven, but we at least need to identify them precisely and not just say privacy.
And have something we can debate over, but whether or not we can measure it, it would be nice to have.
Okay. Well, measurement writ broad.
All right, I think we've got time for at least one more question. Connor?
Yeah. So I had a question. So I think it was Tristan Harris who I first heard refer to where in this changing model going away from advertising that we might end up with kind of a two-tiered consumer market where people who have the education and bandwidth to think about what they're clicking through and the disposable income to engage more subscription-based services might not be susceptible to a lot of these harms that will then be kind of shunted onto a lower class consumer market, emphasizing class divides. Is that something you're worried about at all or have thoughts on?
It's sort of true now, I think. And so, and here's where measurement, and I know I'm going to make Paul's hair stand up on end, but does the ecosystem or do certain platforms exacerbate that problem? In which case, now you have to measure, because you're talking about a degree of something.
Maybe.
And how much is too much? You know, how.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd say, I mean, the development of the infrastructure, you could certainly make the argument that it's done more to eliminate classes as much as create them. So I don't.
Or expand the middle, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you could make a strong argument in both directions. So I don't know if I could get there, that it's obvious that that's what's going to happen. It certainly could. I mean, I think Neville was talking earlier about we still, in this country, we still have a great divide for just basic things like broadband, which kind of seems crazy, given where we started. So, you know, maybe, but I would say, in my opinion, the pluses of the platform that's been created over the last 20 years has done as much to eliminate classes as anything to create them.
Well, again, those are opposing, maybe not even opposing, but those are two different forces. I would say the force of connectivity and enabling accessibility to the information, and then the force of information doesn't really want to be free. That higher quality information is going to cost money, and to the extent that I may end up having to go pay a journalist to go find out a journalist I trust, and so I'll pay him to go tell me, okay, which of these news is fake and which of these should I really read, and that's what blogs are. That's what sources of journalism are today. So I think that it's straightforward that force will exist. To me, it's inevitable.
So can I offer a slight tweak on this question? Neville suggested a lot of new technologies that are coming down the pike, and we've been talking thus far about platforms that exist right now, but we're going to see a lot of new ones come down the pike that are going to bring new benefits and maybe bring new problems that we haven't thought about. Should we be thinking about, Jack, to your earlier formulation, or Casey, I'm sorry, maybe you said this, about industrial policy. Is there industrial policy we should be putting in place before these things come out to guide their development, to maximize benefits, minimize harms?
Should we
Who's
do
your
it when the
point?
government is open or when the government is closed?
We've got a week, so
Let's do it this weekend.
all right. Let's take one more question. Yeah, right back there.
They don't pay any
It wasn't a
attention
real
to it either.
answer. These guys might give you a real answer.
She's learning. She holds up a time up sign and you say one more question. It's every right.
Hi, Jane Bambauer from University of Arizona. So I'm still having trouble understanding the market failure of these social networks, or of the network effects under the conditions of a social network, because traditionally when we've worried about network effects, it's because somebody has to invest in the fax machine or invest in the television set, and they can't buy multiple machines, and so they're sort of stuck with their network. But in social networking, I don't even see, there can be multiple networks that everybody has access to, and they don't have to talk to each other. So this is, I guess I'm directing this question kind of to David. They don't have to talk to each other. They can compete in some sense. And then other than possibly the information failure that Jack talked about, I don't quite understand what keeps a consumer locked in against their will into one social network when they can be on Snapchat and Facebook and Friendster or whatever. So could you please elaborate?
Well, I'm not an expert in that space, but I have an intuition, which is that the cost is not the dollar cost of buying your fax machine. It is the investment you make in creating the profile that you have in that space, and the fact you can't easily extract that and put it someplace else. So, those of us who, I'm in on LinkedIn, but I haven't cared much about my profile. I'm not looking for a job. But you put but you put a lot of time developing that profile. It's a different profile than you have on Facebook, but you can't pry that out. So I think the stickiness is, again, it is a tipping effect. If somebody came along and built a new, MySpace 2 or something like that.
Like Google Plus, you mean?
That's harsh.
It's just sticky.
It's sticky.
I think there is just a lot of inertia, and but the point is, you wouldn't pay in dollars to move; you'd pay in time. And so I have just one. I have 7 different teleconferencing packages on my computer. She likes Zoom. He likes this week. But yeah, and it's trivial for me to install another. There's not a lot of cost, so I think it'd be really hard for one of those to establish dominance. And Facebook gives me free software. Skype gives me free software. I think it's the difference is the investment you make in creating your part of that space that make it sticky.
I certainly wouldn't say that there has been a market failure yet, which I think was kind of fundamental to your question. I don't think we've seen, I personally don't think we've witnessed a market failure yet. I think if I had a concern, it's to the tipping point issue, which is there a tipping point where there is no next way of, if someone holds all the information, I'll say all the information, how does anyone else ever start? And I think that probably more than anything would be the concern I have. I don't know if we've seen that, and certainly history has proven that that's not the case. You look at the MySpaces and the whoever else in the Google. I'm using that, the Google Plus. That's awesome.
Why does that not undermine your point? Google Plus would have been your competitor, or Instagram, or WhatsApp.
But it didn't happen,
Well,
right?
it
I'm just saying. But do you think?
Well, the
So you
biggest
think it's
company
already
there.
happened?
Do I think what?
Do you think it's already happened? You think we already had a
How do you
market
measure? What's your threshold?
failure? My point lasts if you give me enough time.
All right, well, on that note, I'm going to bring us to a close. We'll be back in about 10 minutes with Commissioner Chopra, but in the meantime, please join me in thanking our panel.